morning, everyone, and thank you for joining us. My name is Holly Dagras. I'm a non-resident senior fellow with the Atlantic Council's Middle East programs. I will make my remarks brief to give more time to our incredible lineup. روسری تو در بیار، موهات رو باز کن. عشق من نترس، بخند، به گریه اعتراض کن. Take off your headscarf, let your hair flow. Don't be afraid, my love, laugh, protest against tears, went the lyrics of Iran-based singer Mehdi Yarahi in his defiant new song, Rusarito, Your Headscarf. The song was released weeks before the one-year anniversary of the ongoing anti-establishment protests prompted by the murder of 22-year-old Kurdish Iranian woman Mahsa Jina Amini at the hands of the so-called morality police. Yarahi would be arrested on August 28th. The singer is one of many who have been detained and intimidated ahead of the September 16th protest anniversary. This long list includes activists, journalists, and the families of those killed. Among those is 23-year-old journalist Nazila Maroufian, who was arrested for the fourth time, this time for speaking out against Yarahi's arrest. In an audio recording in early September from Tehran's notorious Evin prison, she spoke of her sexual assault by security forces. Maroufian was just released on bail. Authorities have since also arrested the uncle of Amini. They have also intimidated and interrogated Amini's father for him not to hold a memorial for his daughter on the first anniversary of her death. These are just countless stories pouring out of Iran as the fight continues. Protesters have made it loud and clear that they want the Islamic Republic gone. As I wrote in a recent piece for the Atlantic Council, while some maintain skepticism by pointing to the small numbers in the streets, the vigor of the protests shouldn't be based solely on how many individuals gather in a public space. Every day, women protest by not abiding by mandatory hijab. Gen Z participates in civil disobedience by expressing themselves in the most simple of ways, like rollerblading in the streets. Anti-regime graffiti, such as "Iran is downing in revolution," is scrawled on the walls of various cities and towns, and chants of "Khamenei is a murderer, his guardianship is invalid" are heard from rooftops and windows. In parts of the countries dominated by neglected ethnic minorities, such as Sistan and Baluchistan province, protests continue every Friday after prayer. Historian Ali Ansari recently told me that the ongoing protests are in a, quote, pre-revolutionary phase, meaning within a phase when revolution becomes possible. Speaking to Iranians on the ground taking part in these protests, this is their revolution. We must heed their call. Today, the Atlantic Council's Iran Strategy Project and Strategic Litigation Project are honored to present a panel that speaks to the heart of the story, the people of Iran. And now, it's with great pleasure that I introduce the Undersecretary for Civilian Security, Democracy, and Human Rights, Ozra Zeya. Undersecretary Zeya brings to the role over 3 decades of diplomatic and leadership acumen at the intersection of international peace, security, and human rights. Thank you.
Thank you, Holly, and thank you to the Atlantic Council and the distinguished panel for their leadership and contributions to this important commemoration. 1 year ago tomorrow, Mahsa Amini, known affectionately to her family as Jina, died while in the custody of Iran's so-called morality police. Instead of investigating and holding accountable those responsible, the Iranian regime put forward a false narrative about her death and violently confronted peaceful protests across the country. Iran's leadership killed hundreds of civilians in the crackdown that followed and gravely injured many more. The regime's disgraceful actions knew no bounds in its attempts to silence dissent. We're here today to remember Ms. Amini's life, but we must also remember the protesters, activists, and journalists who were killed, injured, and imprisoned for merely demanding human rights and justice. Journalists Elahe Mohammadi and Nilofar Hamidi, who first broke the news of Ms. Amini's death, remain in jail 1 year later, facing sham trials and charges that carry lengthy prison sentences. Other journalists, like Nazila Maroufian, who Holly mentioned, were arrested because of their unwavering pursuit of the truth. Those who protested the regime's injustice also suffered greatly. Saleh, Mir Hashemi, Majid, Khazemi, and Saeed Yagoubi paid the ultimate price and were executed after what human rights organizations widely called a grossly unfair trial that lacked evidence and relied on confessions reportedly extracted under torture. There are many other stories and names we must remember of those who bravely stood up for human rights in Iran, only to be arrested and handed harsh sentences. So we continue to call for the release of all political prisoners. Mahsa Jina Amini's family, her own family, is still being harassed by the regime, including her recently arrested uncle, Safa Alahe, and reports that her father, Amjad, has been repeatedly intimidated by authorities to prevent the family from holding a memorial service. Tomorrow, 1 year since Mahsa's death, the human rights situation in Iran remains dire. The regime continues to severely restrict Iranians' exercise of their human rights and has increased the surveillance and punishment of women and men and young people who engage in acts of civil disobedience. There are reports that the so-called morality police are back on the streets of major Iranian cities and are cracking down to enforce mandatory hijab laws, including by detaining and handing out penalties and inhumane punishments to women. Notably, Iranian authorities have detained, harassed, and defrocked dozens of religious leaders of Sunni Muslim communities for their peaceful criticism of the arrest and killing of protesters. Members of minority communities have been disproportionately targeted and repressed in the government's brutal responses and have been historic victims of institutional and physical repression by the regime for decades. Sadly, 58 children for the country's Baluch and Kurdish minorities have been killed during this crackdown. This devastating toll tells us that the regime has learned nothing from the protests. Severe repression, threats of sexual assault, harassment on and offline, and unjust imprisonment continue. But despite the intransigence and cruelty of their government, the Iranian people will not be silenced. They stand behind the simple yet powerful message of woman, life, freedom, and continue to speak out and demand respect for their human rights. All the while, the United States, along with our allies and partners around the world, have been listening to the Iranian people. We impose coordinated sanctions on the individuals and entities involved in repression, limiting their access to the global financial system, from the so-called morality police to regime-affiliated interrogator journalists, to senior commanders of the IRGC and law enforcement forces, to the prison system and companies that supply Iranian law enforcement. Access to information and knowledge is power. So we mobilized our resources when the Iranian regime tried to cut off ordinary citizens from accessing the global internet to hide their human rights abuses and prevent the people from exercising their rights to free expression and peaceful assembly. We issued General License D2 to ensure U.S. sanctions did not stand in the way of Iranian people staying connected online. We then worked with U.S. technology firms to help them provide more digital services to people in Iran, from access to cloud computing services to better tools to enhance their online security and privacy. We surged support for circumvention tools, enabling Iranians to maintain access to information. During the height of the protests, the United States provided unprecedented support and anti-censorship tools that reached 30 million Iranians, nearly 1 in 3, to help them stay connected with the world via the internet and share accounts of the brutal crackdown. In response, Secretary Blinken declared that the international community has come together to condemn and confront Iran's brutal crackdown, and we will continue to act in support of the right of the Iranian people to speak out for their fundamental freedoms. U.S. commitment is steadfast, and we remain vigilant and ready to hold human rights violators accountable. That's why I'm proud to share that today, in coordination with our allies, we're announcing 29 additional sanctions designations against Iranian officials and entities connected to serious human rights abuses against ordinary Iranian citizens and the restriction of the free flow of information. These sanctions seal off those individuals and entities from the U.S. financial system, and they also ensure the perpetrators of human rights abuses do not remain anonymous. We've also taken steps to impose further visa restrictions under the Immigration and Nationality Act on 13 Iranian officials responsible for or complicit in the abuse, detention, or killing of peaceful protesters. We also previously imposed sanctions on an Iranian company, Arvan Cloud, a key partner of the regime and its Ministry of Intelligence and Security, which worked to censor, disrupt, and surveil the internet used by the people of Iran. Last December, we listened to calls from Iranian civil society for international action, including for women political prisoners inside Evin prison. And we responded by leading efforts within the United Nations to have Iran removed from the Commission on the Status of Women. We also supported the establishment of a fact-finding mission at the UN Human Rights Council, which is continuing their investigation into potential human rights violations committed against protesters during the events following the death of Mahsa Amini, especially those involving women and girls. We once again call on Iran to cooperate with the international fact-finding mission by allowing unhindered and safe access to evidence, victims, and witnesses inside the country. Sadly, we have no expectation that they will do so. So faced with this grim reality, who then will shape the future of Iran? I think on this point, it's important to note a statement by President Biden that he made during his most recent visit to the Middle East. And he said, he shared his deeply held belief that the future will be won by societies that unleash the full potential of their populations and where citizens can criticize and question their leaders without fear of reprisal. I share the president's sentiment, and I believe that Iran's leadership should allow the people of Iran to shape the country's future instead of trying to silence them. Right now, Iran is facing problems of its own making. Its leadership should be listening to the people, not shooting them, arresting them indiscriminately, censoring their voices, and disrupting their access to the global internet. Iran's state-sponsored violence against women and the undermining of their human rights must end. Civil society is an essential component of advancing fundamental freedoms in Iran, here in the United States and in countries all around the world. Mahsa Jina Amini's death and the deaths of hundreds of other brave Iranians at the hands of their own government were tragic, but they have not died in vain. Today's gathering and those around the world honor their memories through our sustained action. The United States will continue to stand with the people of Iran and stand up for the human rights of all Iranians. We will also deepen our work with allies and partners, including at the United Nations, to support efforts to shed light on the ongoing crackdown and human rights abuses in Iran, and to forever hold perpetrators to account. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Undersecretary Zaya. And now it's an absolute delight to introduce my dear friend, CBS News correspondent Roxana Strawberry. Roxana was previously based in London as a CBS News foreign correspondent, reporting on Europe and the Middle East. She has also lived and reported from Tehran for 6 years. In 2009, she was imprisoned for 100 days on baseless allegations of espionage. She is the author of Between Two Worlds, My Life and Captivity in Iran, a memoir about her experiences. Roxana, over to you.
Thank you, Holly. And thank you, everyone, for joining us. I want to introduce, first of all, a guest who is joining us remotely, Mercedes Shahin-Kar. She was protesting last fall when, in October, she was shot in the eye. But instead of hiding her injury, she was outspoken about it. She's a fitness instructor and a mother of a young girl. They had to flee Iran earlier this year after security forces raided their home. She now lives in Germany for treatment. Mercedes, I don't know if she can hear us, yes? Okay, I can't see her, so. Mercedes Jan, از اینکه با شما آشنا میشم خیلی خوشحالم. I can't hear,
I thank you so much for your invitation. I'm happy I'm here. I can hear you fine.
Okay. So for everyone who's listening, we have a simultaneous translator. I'll let Mercedes go ahead and tell her own experiences. لطفاً بفرمایید مرسدی جان اگه بشه توضیح بدید تجربیاتتون چجوری بود چرا تو این تظاهرات شرکت کردید
As Mercedes Jan, please tell me what was your experience, how you participated in the demonstration. Well, look, me and other people who came to the streets, and before that, previously, we still had problems with the Islamic Republic. And for the incidents that happened years ago from Green Movement, Aban movements, Aban 96, all of these years, it caused us that people waiting for another incident to take them out in the streets. We, as a women in Iran, we already never had rights, and they always suppressed us in the worst way possible. And the law is never been behind the Iranian women. Also, we have lots of economic hardships due to the high corruption by the government. One of the things is that we don't like the enforced hijab, and we don't want to be covered by that. After the death of Mahsa Amini, we came to the streets, and this movement, not only it was us being against the hijab, mandatory hijab, we just wanted to show our dissatisfaction with Islamic Republic, and we just wanted to say we don't want Islamic Republic anymore. When I was in the street, it was very hard for us to have confidence to anyone else, and we had no idea if they are on their side or the government side. But if we could find the right people to talk to, from women, men, children, everyone was saying, we just want these to go. We don't want Islamic Republic. They are just giving us suppression, destitute, economic hardship. No Western country or European country does anything for us, and we have to do anything for ourselves. The people really, I'm trying to say they are deeply frustrated of the Islamic Republic. The world thinks the people want Islamic Republic, but that's not the case. The people, only people themselves could come outside and show that we don't want Islamic Republic. On the other side, Iranian diaspora outside the country, they were the echoed the Iranian voice, and they helped a lot for the people for the world to understand Islamic Republic should go from Iran.
I want to ask you a question. Thank you for bringing us up to speed on what people inside Iran were thinking and what many of them still do think. Can you talk a little bit about your own experience and how you are now? I know many protesters did get blinded. What happened to you, and what gives you the strength to keep speaking out?
ببینید خب
Look, the suppression itself is too much and it's too brutal in Iran. When this happened to me, they shot me with a paintball gun. It was very horrifying because I was unarmed. I was unarmed, and I was out for the least rights of myself and my peace of mind. And the same way the other people came out just to protest. And the response was with the rifles, full metal jackets, batons, and air guns, and many variety of tortures in prisons, and they also executed many people, many like me, or maybe 1,000 people. They were intentionally were shot in the eye. They knew that eye is the most important organ in the body, and if anyone loses the eyesight uh, till the end of the life is ruined. I mean, my life was became chaotic. My friends, we found each other, we talked to each other, and we understand that how this affected all our life. Just you try just to for 24 hours just block your eyes, just one of your eyes, and see how you can, if you have a numer life. I've had two eyes for 39 years. I had a life. I studied, I worked, I got a child, but but for my least of my rights, armless, being attacked, me and my other friends. And this is a horrifying injustice that the Islamic Republic did to us. And after that, all of us were really, really in horrifying situations. And after they took my eyesight away from me, they attacked my home. I didn't have security inside my own house. The same way, all of those people who are lost their eyesight are installed inside Iran, and those others, they are facing cases, made up cases, and their allegation is that they just did against the regime, against the supreme leader, or tried to sound their voice. They took lots of money, and took lots of on bail from what we owned. But I forced, for the security of myself, safety of myself, and which was horrifying situation. I had to flee the country. I knew this is going to happen to me too. Generally, while we are talking about this movement and the support that people outside Iran showed, I have to tell you this. There was a time that I just finished my eye surgery, and it was horrifying. All the time, I was following the news with one eye in a way that I was on about face, on the mattress, so I could only hear, not be able to listen. So the news was from Europe, from Western Europe, that they were trying to put IRGC on the terror list. The people were so hopeful in that time. I didn't care about my eyesight. I still don't care about my eyesight. But we thought, is it gonna happen? Are they listening to our voice? Is IRGC going to be a terrorist list? But I don't know, unfortunately, why it happened. I don't know till when Islamic Republic wants to give ransom or pay money to the Western countries to stay over there and still keep in power, and again act against those countries while they are not doing anything for their own people, and they are horrifyingly suppressing their own people. If they had more power, they do the worst thing to other countries in the world. I'm just hearing in the news that America is paying $6 billion for release of hostages to Iran. And this is at the same time they are saying while we are sanctioning the officials, Iranian officials. The sanctioned Iranian official has no use for the Iranian people. Those officials doing their job, they're submitting, they're giving executions, they are killing, they are suppressing, they are doing many other things. The important thing is, if this huge amount of money goes to in the hand of the Islamic Republic, that regime goes buy and guns from other countries and uses it against his own people. These are horrifying, and when people see these, it just devastates them. They know no one is behind. They think no one is behind them. These sanctions are just empty words. These are not practical movements to help the Iranian people during this time, and this is very disheartening. This country, Iran, is very rich, and the people are losing money and money all the time. Destitute is becoming worse over time, and they are just in a chaos, a vortex of chaos all day and night. They want to do something for themselves, but they are armless. They have nothing to stay against the brutality of Islamic Republic. They have proxies, groups outside the country. They pay groups outside the country to come inside the country and just suppress people. Apart from what do they have? These are horrifying, heartbreaking. And if other countries in the world, this happens to them, what are they trying to do? How they can save themselves if they are facing the same thing?
Mercedes-Jan, thank you so much for sharing your experiences, your insights, and your perspectives. I'm very sorry, and I think many people here would agree, for what you had to suffer and what many Iranians have had to endure. But thank you for sharing your journey with us.
خیلی ممنونم. مرسی از شما
I
که
thank you a lot. I dearly thank you for the invitation. I'll do whatever I can to be the voice of the people. In last 11 months, I've had horrifying hardship. Me and my people, all of us went through hardships. I was hoping to be effective in any ways. The other countries, Western countries, get to this conclusion that Islamic Republic faces its expiration and it needs to go.
Thank you, Mercedes-Jan. Okay, wow. Well, I want to introduce our other panelists now. I'll start with Roya, who's sitting right to my side here. Roya Burumand has a PhD in the history of international relations and is the executive director of the Abdurrahman Burumand Center. It focuses on education and documentation of human rights violations in Iran, including executions. Roya has led advocacy efforts at the United Nations, the European Union, and elsewhere, and organized campaigns for legal reforms in Iran and against the Islamic Republic's abuse of the death penalty. She now serves as chair of the Impact Iran Coalition, which is a group of 17 NGOs that draw attention to the situation of human rights in Iran. We also have with us Shukriya Bradost. Pronouncing it correctly? Yes. Yes, She's an Iranian Kurdish Middle Eastern security analyst, and she was a lawyer as well. She is a frequent commentator in various media outlets. She's also a doctoral candidate at Virginia Tech University, where she focuses on the securitization of ethnic groups in post-revolutionary Iran. Since fleeing Iran in 2004, she has been sentenced twice in absentia for her activism. And I just found out last night, Shukriya was part of a woman-led operation that sent the first Starlink satellite internet devices to Iran, which is fascinating. I definitely want to hear about that.
You're the first one sharing this news.
Fabulous. We like to make news. Khosrow Esfahani is an Iranian journalist and researcher. He left Iran in 2021 and now writes for the Atlantic Council and Article 19, which is an international organization that promotes freedom of expression. Khosrow has written about health and human rights violations in Iran, as well as Iran's violence against protesters, the persecution of ethnic, religious, and LGBTQ minorities, and Iran's health crises. Khosrow has also helped the BBC document and verify the identity of 75 Iranians killed in the protests. Khosrow, why don't we start with you? We heard a little bit from the previous speakers about what the situation is in Iran. Now, tomorrow marks 1 year since Mahsa Jina Amini's death, and that sparked protests for months. What is the situation on the ground in Iran?
As we speak, early this morning there were protests in southeast Iran, the impoverished Sistan Baluchistan province, which is populated by literally the most persecuted group in Iranian society. They took to streets with placards reading that we are not going to leave Kurdistan standalone. And the importance of this solidarity action by them can only be understood if you take into account what is happening today in Kurdistan. Over the past week, the regime in Iran has been dispatching heavy military forces to Kurdish regions. They have almost in all but name have imposed martial law in Kurdish regions of Iran. At the same time, in a couple of days, a security deal between the Tehran regime and the Iraqi government is coming up, in which the Iraqi government has committed to disarm Kurdish groups in Kurdistan region of Iraq. The Iranian regime has established heavy military presence at the border. They have deployed tanks, they have deployed missile launchers, and they are ready to take revenge on the people of Kurdistan if something happens. But last year, after Mahsa Amini died, the whole nation rose up. They have been demanding change, and they have refused to be chained back. They have refused to go back to the cage that the Islamic Republic has been holding them in for 4 decades. We have been talking with people on the ground, and they are showing no sign that they are going to go back to those chains. I was talking with a Baluch activist, Fariba Baluch. She has been working on the Baluch ethnic minority for years. She's one of those brave souls that has sacrificed everything for the cause. And a couple of weeks ago, the regime, not being able to touch her, they took her son and brother hostage, but she refused to remain silent. I was talking with her, and she told me, a people that has nothing to lose but its chains is the strongest. And the voice of the Iranian people will be victorious eventually.
Thank you, Khosrow. And why don't we actually pick up on that, Shukriya, because you focused a lot on the Kurdish areas, which Khosrow talked about. What is the atmosphere like there? We just heard it's very securitized. Do you think that people there who took part in the protests have achieved anything from the protests? What was their role? And what are their lives like now? I know it's a very general statement, but if you could summarize.
Thank you, Roxana. Thank you for your kind introduction. Thank you for Atlantic Council for putting together that timely event, and thank you for you all joining us today. Allow me to start with the story of a young girl in Iran. Some of you may have heard that story, but I will repeat myself after 1 year. In 2003, a young girl in Iran with her friends in high school, they established a group in the city. It's called Women Life for Freedom. 2003. And after 1 year of activity of this group, 3 of them forced to leave Iran through mountain. They fled the country to Iraqi Kurdistan. One of them joined the guerrilla warfare Kurdish political party. Other one, she had a different and hard path. She married, she got divorced, then she went to Europe. The other one, she's starting law school and become a lawyer and journalist and wrote about all what's happening in the country. That girl was me. And now I'm sitting here and talking about this slogan, this movement. It's worldwide here in Washington, D.C. We're talking about, for me, it's heartwarming. After almost 20 years, I achieved what we started, not just for me, for all Iranian. And then Islamic regime in 2010, when I became one of the well-known journalists in Iraqi Kurdistan, and I work as a lawyer, they, as you mentioned, they give me 10 years in absentia because I'm writing about Islamic regime brutality behavior. And then in 2016, when I was chosen as one of the young leaders in the region, they took my brother as a hostage, which is very well-known policy of Islamic regime. Then they sent out other brother to Kurdistan region and asked me, you're going to collaborate with us or we're going to kill you? That's how, by December 2016, I decided to leave my second home. And I came to the DC, to the United States, to starting against the Islamic regime, continue the same struggle that I started with my friend in 2003. Why I'm telling you this story, to tell you that's not new for us as Iranian. It didn't start by the killing of the Jina Amini. It started the same day with the generation before us when the Islamic regime in 1979, they promised a lot of lies and failed policy that we're going to build a democratic and best life for you as ethnic groups, different ethnic groups in Iran. And when they took a power, they cracked down all the voice and established a radical Islamic regime, a revolutionary government. We know when we're talking about the revolution, what revolutionary means. Revolutionary means is you're still looking for a change. And what change Islamic regime is looking for? Not inside Iran. They are looking for changing outside of Iran. What change outside Iran? To turn all the country to a radical Muslim country, radical Shia Muslim country. And it's interestingly how you're going to do with most of the region are Sunni Muslim, not the Shia, which I was two minority in Iran. I was Sunni and I was Kurd. So when we're talking about the revolutionary government, you have to know what kind of the government we're talking about, that they still took all Iranian as a hostage, using all Iranian sources. We know Iran is one of the wealthy country in the region. Natural resource, geopolitical location of Iran tells you this country one of the regional power. What the Islamic regime ruling this country, the people are suffering, not just for freedom of speech, for daily life, economic collapse. All people's life is. I was reading some news about the poverty. 70% of Iranian is under poverty line right now. We're talking. So that's the introduction about the regime we're addressing here. And about the Kurdish region right now, Khosrow already mentioned what's going on. Now we're talking, the regime employed military equipment in Kurdish cities, and there are tanks around the Jina cemetery. Tank for preventing people to gathering tomorrow. That shows how weak regime is, actually. If you brought tank for just facing civilian protests, that shows how weak government you are. That's the reason, whenever I'm talking to some people in power, in administration here in DC, I tell them, you know, the face that regime showing you, they can control everything, that's a fake face. They're really not on control of anything in the country. What they have controlling power is by military force, by killing civilians. You have a civilian people with no weapon, and they have a military tanks in front of these people. And for a few days ago, they arrest most of these activists, the family who lost their beloved one, to just prevent this gathering for tomorrow, which is a bad news for the regime. The gathering for tomorrow may not be successful, that's what we're expecting, but that revolutionary movement has started. It's not going to be stopped by any tank. the revolution that now we're talking about Iran before the woman life revolution and after woman life revolution. And it's not just about Iran. Why this slogan of woman life freedom becomes so universal? Because it's a historical moment, not just for Iranian, for the region and for the world. For the region, I call it a renaissance. A most populated country in the Muslim region, the people are standing for a secular government, standing away from any religious and radical opinions. For the region, we always talking about how radical group trying to attack civilians. For the region, for years here in DC, we're talking after 9/11, how they're trying to securitize every individual's life. So that's how the changing of the Middle East region is starting from the Iranian most populated country. And the Iranian can be the lead of this change. I call it the renaissance of the Middle East. Sorry, it was long answer.
Okay. No, thank you, Shokri. And
There's a lot to talk about it.
there's so many good points in there. And to describe it as a renaissance, it seems very accurate. I do want to get to what has changed in Iran, what the protests achieved. I mean, you did talk about how there's no going back, that it was a turning point, these protests. But before we get there, I want to bring in Roya as well. Roya, you focus a lot on executions and the documentation of executions in Iran. How many protesters, people linked to the protests, have been hanged? How many are still on death row? Could you give us an overview of the situation of people who are still facing prison sentences and other punishments because of their role in the protests?
Yeah, thank you for the question. It's I'm taking you back to the cemetery now.
Yeah.
All the world focus on the cemetery. You're not the only one.
Yeah.
Well, so if we want to have an update on all this, we're going to need lunch, right? Because
okay, yes, yeah. Okay, so brief update,
FYI.
overview.
I don't think we can separate the executions from the protest killings. All of these are very, very connected. And so as far as the protest deaths, so far we have more or less verified 495 deaths, but the number is definitely higher than that. Some of the people got wounded and died in the weeks, the months later, and we don't always hear about them. Obviously, the Baluch and Kurdish minorities have been the most affected. The number of executions have also gone up tremendously. We have 659 people executed from October 2022 to August 31st, 2023, which in the same period the year before, we had about 440. There were 7 known protest-related executions, and I insist on known because a lot of people are killed on trumped-up charges, and their families are too disconnected, too vulnerable to come forward to talk. Out of these, in addition to these 7 who were killed without the minimum standard of due process of law in summary trials, we have also 5 other political motivated killings, 2 of which on charges of blasphemy, which usually the state keeps quiet, but they did make public announcement about it. And these people had activities on Telegram, and they were, we looked into what they were doing, and they were just challenging religious zealots with religious questions, or kind of making fun of their beliefs. But this is really symptomatic of a state that is very worried about the state of disbelief in the country, right? I mean, over the years, religious minorities have been killed because there are conversions. The theocracy is losing its Muslims. So, and I think that the women life freedom movement is also in some sense the expression of a rejection of a forced imposed hijab, but also religion. So In terms of the arrests, it's very hard to know how many people have been arrested. As you know, reporting is, journalists are put in prison, lawyers, former prisoners, the minute they start to speak, they are persecuted again. Why this lady is out, Shahin Kar is out, and many others, is that they started to post pictures of themselves and they started to get together, you know, and help each other heal, basically. So, and that is also punished. So it's very hard to know. What we know is that the arrests were way above 20,000. The Chief Justice, a notorious former intelligence person, mentioned that 22,000, I think 370, I'm not sure about the number, of people were affected by the leader's pardon. So among them, there are journalists, influencers, activists, 45 lawyers just in the first few months of the protests. Now the number is probably 50 to 60. And I'm not talking about other forms of harassment, summons, intimidations aimed at silencing them. There were preventive arrests of people who had done nothing yet. And now they are starting again, because obviously the state is very concerned about the protest anniversary. And in the past 2 months, every single family who has lost a loved one has been summoned, phone calls, you know, repeated phone calls, arrests, their homes were raided in order for them not to commemorate their loved one, and not to call other people to join them, because and that has been, you know, a problem for the states from the beginning of these protests, because they weren't able to calm them down. Like the Kurds, you know, they would take buses and go from city to city to visit each other's graves. Then they were connected to people who were killed in the previous protests. The Baluch came out every week for months, for 6 or 7 months, right? And so we are in a very different context here. And like students, you know, this universities and high schools were hotbeds of protests. In the past couple of months, more than 3,100 students have been in some way punished or warned or, you know, suspended from university or summoned at the intelligence or prevented from getting, you know, services in the university. And that these are Herana's number, because we don't do. And at least 292 people were arrested just in the last 2 months to prevent the arrests. So, you know, it's very difficult to understand the scope of what's happening. But what is sure is that there is a systematic attempt to prevent people from coming out during these protests. And whether or not they're going to succeed, I can't say. I think that, as you heard from the panelists, people are committed not to go back to their chains, whether it's the mother of Pir Falak or the mother of Artin or or these women who are saying we're not going back. I mean, we interviewed someone who had received 6 or 7 paintballs, you know, and the Basij tells, I mean, the plainclothes guy tells, leave or I will shoot you in the eye. Mm-hmm. So she leaves because at this point she believes that he's meaning it, mm-hmm. but then she falls and from the pain of these paintballs, and then she sees them pulling 2 women on the ground away, and so she lifts her head and says, stop pulling, you know, like, so instead of taking care of herself, she says, stop taking these women, and then she's shot in the eye. So, you know, it's a very complicated situation, and at the same time, a very simple situation. And what these people need is these kind of events, right? So that people don't forget about what's happening to them, so that they put up with the pain and they keep going.
Thank you, Roya. Gosh, there's so much to think about and so many questions that come to mind when you all speak. I want to ask a question to all of you, and we'll eventually go to audience questions as well. I'm not sure how much time we have, but okay, because I think we're running a little bit behind. But first of all, we talked a little bit about how this desire for change still exists, the resistance still exists, but what are the tangible achievements? What can we see that has actually changed due to the protests? And what are the less visible ones for people who haven't been following that closely in the past year? Does anybody want to go ahead?
Actually, because you first asked me this question,
Yes.
what have been changed for Kurds, for Baluch, for other ethnic groups in Iran? For years, Islamic regimes try to demonize these ethnic groups. Maybe it would be a surprise or shock for you that a pilot sitting down in national TV and talking about the Kurds eating pilot meat. It's crazy, isn't it? That's how national TV is talking about the ethnic group, own people in the same country and trying to demonize them. Or how Kurds like beheading people. During this protest, this revolutionary movement, I was talking to a girl in Germany, one of the activists. We were talking about what to do. And she told me, Shukriya, whenever I was in Tehran, grew up in Tehran, whenever in the morning I was going to school with my dad, I saw some Kurds coming from the Kurdistan to Tehran to find a job. When I saw them, I was scared. I said, why you were scared? She said, because I saw Kurds always killing people. We're talking about that kind of the regime and disinformation and propaganda.
So they were trying to not only demonize these ethnic minority groups, like the Kurds.
Demonize what part of it? And then what was else? They're talking about that they are separatists, traitor, trying to, the agent of the American, the agent of the Israel, whatever you can call it, long list about the Kurds. Why they scare about this moment? If people unite, if we don't have enemy inside, because they pick Kurds and make the enemy of the country and unite rest of the country against that part. And that part was the part since 1979 they fighting against Islamic regime, because the referendum for Islamic regime, they say no. And since 1979, they're trying to take revenge for that no to the Khomeini and Khamenei's radical rule. And what happened now with this, when this women life freedom started from Kurdistan and followed with all cities in Tehran, other cities, regime was shocked. They didn't expect that after this long 4 decades of this kind of the propaganda, now people supporting Kurds. That was the turning political landscape in Iran. And all this year, after 1 year, we're talking about the anniversary of that uprising. All this year, we as a Kurdish activist, we as an Iranian who's fighting for the democratic Iran, we're fighting with the regime propaganda again. In the old social media, like when I talk, it's a separatist girl. When you are a Kurd, you are a separatist, you are a traitor. And how the Islamic regime's propaganda in social media may work in some place, unfortunately. That's a reality we have to face, we have to work on it. We still, at the beginning of the movement, it was great. It was united country, united people against this propaganda.
But now?
But the time, the regime's disinformation in the social media, because they found social media is really helpful for the people outside of Iran, the Iranian and diaspora. So what they did, they brought everything with the way, we don't have a regime's power and money and sources to build this movie, to build this cyber behind the social media. We don't have that money, we don't have that power. We're talking about the regime that all money goes for that kind of activity, supporting terrorist group in the region, supporting all Hezbollah and Hashd Sha'bi. So we're talking about that kind of the regime. Now they have a cyber militia group. So for the activists, it wasn't easy, and it's not easy to fight against these cyber militia terrorist groups. So that's the reason I'm worried right now. I'm worried right now because tomorrow is anniversary. How much are we united right now? So now how many people, now we're talking about the military equipment right now in Kurdish region. how many opposition groups in DC talking about Kurdish region right now, the situation of the civilian Kurds who are now in the war zone. So that's scaring me, seriously. I want to share with you, with the audience, that's really scaring me. Are we united? My voice is not just for the American, my voice is for all my co-Iranian, the opposition who are standing against the regime. Because if you want to stand against the regime, we have one enemy, that's the Islamic regime. For the more democratic one, you have to first admit that Iran is a diverse country. You have to fight for not just for your right from each city you're from. You have to fight for the Kurdish right, the Baluchi right. When you're talking about the religious minority is not the only problem. Ethnic minority, ethno-national minority are another issues that we have to have a plan and a strategy to face that reality of diversity. And diversity is a wealth we have. Unfortunately, I'm worried about that, about the achievement. Let's see tomorrow what will happen, which I'm not telling you if tomorrow nothing happened, we don't have that huge gathering, it means the revolution's dead. We're not going back before that women life freedoms movement. But we're talking about, it shows how much we can keep together as opposition groups, as people who stand against the Islamic regime for better future of Iran.
Well, maybe to respond also to your questions quickly, tangible change is that these young people have changed the narrative. So they have shown that they're not ideological. So they don't care about, East and West and, imperialism and all of the stuff that their generation before them. And they also have been very clear about the fact that they don't want anything. And so the change is that they have no demands. I don't say this is good or bad, but they have no demands from the state anymore. They're not asking for the Ershad to go there. They have no demand. They want the whole thing to be gone. So I think that changing this narrative has been very important, and it requires a little bit of change in policy. And you see that, I hear in some Kurdish town, there are girls who have short tops and show their stomach, right? A lot of places, women walk without the scarf. And so, something has changed. The question is, how do we help them keep that change? Because the laws are toughening, right? So the state is getting organized to go after them, and they know how to do that. They have learned it from the playbook of the Soviet Union. They harm the person, but they also harm the family. So, we need to think out of the box.
I mean, that is a question. How does the international community help them? And we heard the Undersecretary, the Undersecretary of State just explaining earlier that the that the administration is announcing new sanctions for human rights violators and tightening visa restrictions and trying to help Iranians with communications. As I still want to ask you about Starlink, but what else can the international community do? Is that enough? Is it a step in the right direction? And what can ordinary people do? I know these are a lot of questions, but Khosrow, do you have any thoughts?
Before we move to that
Yes.
question, the legacy of 4 decades of Islamic Republic has been pain, soul-shattering pain, and breaking the whole nation into these isolated islands, people who were divided, as Shukriye described, different groups being constantly demonized as terrorists, as the corrupt, as the misled, and the labels were numerous. Jina's death, her blood, and the fire of this recent uprising has bound this nation together. The people in Iran have found a new identity, a new core that has brought them together. They are standing for something for the first time in decades. We have had different uprisings. We had the Green Movement, we had the November 2019 uprising, but each and every one of them were driven by a different social group. But what happened with Jina's death, that historic moment, it gave birth to a new nation that sees itself with all the divisions, with all the differences, while acknowledging that we have ethnic minorities who are nations in their own right. but we came to a point that we see ourselves united against an enemy which is hell-bound to quash this nation. And people inside the country, unlike the diaspora who is sitting in safe capitals outside Iran, have been working.
Not always safe.
Yeah, yes. But compared to what our people are facing in Iran, all of us are safe.
That's true.
Yes, they have been sending assassins and trying to kill people. I'm not ignoring that. And our families are at risk. Yes, we are facing risks. But we are talking about a context that over 500 people were killed. Yeah. We are talking of a context that 70 children were among those who were killed. So whatever happens to us who are living outside Iran is nothing in my book compared to that courage and the cost of their resistance. And this nation, under this totalitarian state that has been denying every chance of creating any form of organization, has been pushing for change, fundamental change. As Roya pointed out, these people, those who are taking to the streets, still are taking to the streets. The protests have not died down. They are smaller in number because the cost of gathering in large crowds is too high. They are demanding fundamental change in Iran. They want an end to Supreme Leader's death cult, a death cult that is asking children to vow fidelity to this 84-year-old man, asking them to sacrifice the lives of their parents for the Supreme Leader. This whole nation is saying no to this death cult and is united in that fight. On your question about what the international community can do, I'm just going to say very shortly. The same way that a lot of divisions among the diaspora has led to us living outside Iran, failing the people inside Iran, the international community has also failed. We have not seen any meaningful action from the international community yet. Sanctions targeting a specific official sitting in Tehran with all his money safe in Iran, that's not going to cut it. We need meaningful action. Yes, technological support has helped. Yes, that is important, but for every and each of those technological supports, the civil society, the Iranian civil society, had to fight for months. International powers should get their act together.
I want to add something about international support.
I'm sorry, I'm being told that we have to move on to audience questions. Actually, before we get there, hopefully we will be able to discuss this as when we get to the audience questions. Before we get to the Q&A session, we're going to hear from Lissandra Novo, who's a staff lawyer here at, no? Yes? Okay, there she is. Hello. Lissandra is a staff lawyer of Strategic Litigation Project, the Rafiq Hariri Center, and Middle East Programs. And please go ahead.
Thank you. So this is a good segue, actually, about what the international community can do. We at the Strategic Litigation Project are releasing a report next week about accountability options available at the international level. As is clear from this discussion, there are no domestic accountability options available in Iran for obvious reasons. This has been also alluded to by the Special Rapporteur of Human Rights in Iran, who has remarked that, again, as we heard in this panel today, this violence that has been going on has been some of the worst in decades and could even be classified as crimes against humanity. And because domestic accountability options aren't available, but this movement has sparked calls for accountability, we're hoping that this report that we're releasing will act as a reference for those who want to know more about what options do exist at the international level for pursuing accountability, both for this current violence, but even further back. The report is about 100 pages, and we look at both courts and international bodies that are competent to address human rights violations on the territory of Iran. Of the mechanisms, I want to highlight specifically the fact-finding mission on Iran. Undersecretary Zaya mentioned this in her keynote remarks. This body was established after a special session was held by the UN Human Rights Council in November 2022. Its mandate is to investigate human rights violations that have occurred in Iran since the beginning of the protest last September, especially with regards to women and children. This is the only body, to my knowledge, that is actually both investigating but also documenting these human rights violations that are taking place in Iran. In addition to being the only body that's documenting these, its mandate requires it to do so with a view to cooperating with legal proceedings in the future, should any arise. They're still taking information from civil society up through the end of this year and will release a final report in March 2024, after which the fact-finding mission's mandate will end unless it is renewed. We think it is extremely important that the mandate be renewed, not only because this is the only body investigating and documenting these human rights violations that are going on, but because the evidence that it collects could feed into what are called structural investigations and other national proceedings in other countries. A structural investigation is where a national authority can launch a general investigation without needing a specific named subject. But the experts appointed to the fact-finding mission have to call for a renewal themselves. This is really important because, as far as we know, there are no structural investigations concerning Iran anywhere in the world, whereas by comparison, Germany, for example, has structural investigations into Syria and Ukraine. Canada launched a structural investigation into Ukraine. And we also know that Islamic Republic perpetrators have roles and are involved in these particular conflicts as well. So not only should there be new structural investigations created by countries that allow for them, but the countries that already have structural investigations open into Syria and Ukraine should include the role of Islamic Republic perpetrators in these structural investigations. Often these perpetrators are the same ones responsible for human rights violations back in Iran. So there's significant overlap there. These structural investigations, they're not just symbolic when you consider the fact that Islamic Republic perpetrators do travel to some of these countries. We've had numerous reports in the past years of Islamic Republic perpetrators traveling to Germany, for example, and having a structural investigation that's already open would allow countries that are visited by Islamic Republic perpetrators to react quickly, to be able to issue arrest warrants and actually launch prosecutions. This is kind of what happened already with the Nuri trial. So for example, in Sweden, the first ever trial under universal jurisdiction relating to the 1988 executions took place in Sweden, where Hamid Nuri was arrested upon the authorities learning that he was traveling through the country. In July of 2022, he was convicted for his role in the 1988 executions. And universal jurisdiction is a law that allows countries to launch investigations and prosecutions into international crimes like genocide, crimes against humanity, war crimes, and torture, regardless of where the crime took place, and without neither the victim nor the perpetrator needing to have the nationality of that country that's launching the investigation. And that's why Sweden was able to prosecute Hamid Nuri for crimes committed in Iran in 1988. And so we really encourage countries that have these laws to prioritize these cases. Structural investigations and universal jurisdiction cases are a matter of political will. And so these countries, especially European states known to be travel destinations for these perpetrators, should both open up these investigations, cooperate with bodies like the fact-finding mission to share evidence, and ultimately launch prosecutions when available. We have another report coming out later this fall, actually, about universal jurisdiction systems in some European countries that goes into more detail about the different national laws. But this report coming out next week takes a look at the international side of things, as, for example, a new treaty that was recently adopted and will open for signature in early 2024. This is the Ljubljana Hague Convention about Mutual Legal Assistance. It's got a long name, but essentially it's meant to create an obligation for the states that ratify it to cooperate with each other's national units in sharing evidence, information, and facilitating these prosecutions. International prosecutions like these are extremely difficult, due in large part to the fact that evidence is located outside of the country that's doing the prosecution. Witnesses are located outside of the country that's doing the prosecution. And even countries, for example, within the EU, it's neither easy nor fast to share relevant information or to gain access to other countries in order to interview witnesses. And so this treaty, if ratified, would make that an obligation for all of the states parties. It's also really important because, for example, as its own treaty, it lies outside the Rome Statute and the ICC. Iran is not a member of the International Criminal Court, and so that makes it extremely difficult to have any case go on there, and many countries that are also not members for where Iranian Islamic Republic perpetrators may be likely to travel. But if they signed on to this treaty, it would create an obligation to at the very least cooperate with any other country that is in fact launching a prosecution. The treaty also contains extradition and prosecution obligations for core international crimes. And I want to make my remarks brief, and so I'll wrap up there and just say that the report touches on several other international mechanisms. It includes information on the current campaign, for example, to expand the definition of the crime against humanity of apartheid to include gender, and that campaign focuses on Iran and Afghanistan. It also touches on several UN mechanisms and provides details on how to, for example, submit information to the United Nations working groups on arbitrary detentions and enforce disappearances. So I'll wrap up there, and any questions I'm available. Thank you.
Thank you, Lysandra. We'll look out for that report next week. We're going to take some questions now from the audience. I don't know if anybody here has any, but there are a couple. Yes, go ahead. Right there. Yeah.
Hi. So I'm Mia Baxley. I'm a Scoville Peace Fellow, and as like a Gen Z person myself, I've seen a lot of the social media posts from protesters around my age. But what is the generational divide and the views on the protests like? If you have any insight in that, and how is that creating setbacks with attempts for regime change?
Okay, and I'll just repeat the question for anybody who might be listening online. The question from our audience was about Gen Z in Iran, the young generation who is largely behind the protests and on the front lines of the protests in Iran. The question is, what is the generational divide when it comes to the view of the protests? And the second part was, what was the second part again? Sorry.
And how is that creating setbacks for regime change?
And how is that creating setbacks for regime change? If anybody wants to take that here.
Well, I mean, I guess the generational divide is what my co-panelists talked about. We have an exile community and like a grown-up community that is concerned about things that are not relevant right now to remove the Islamic Republic. What we have here is gender discrimination, discrimination on the basis of religion and on the basis of ethnicity, and that is what has held the country back. Monopolizing the rule of the country based on discrimination. So we have to fight this first before we get into our disputes over, you know, what should happen in Iran afterwards. And I think that's what, you know, is the main obstacle to change, maybe, or to fight the Islamic Republic more effectively?
A question for Hosro from somebody who's listening online. In the lead up to the protest anniversary, the internet has slowed. Can you talk more about that?
This is a classic tactic of the Islamic Republic. Whenever there is a chance of protest, internet is either shut down fully or is slowed down severely. Reports that I've been receiving from Tehran and other cities, especially the Kurdish areas, the internet has been slowed down. People cannot even send text messages via WhatsApp. But the thing with Iranian people is that facing this wall of censorship for decades, they are very tech savvy. Every Iranian grandma and grandfather has a full set of VPNs at their disposal that they are ready to use to get the news.
And some people have now access to Starlink.
Yes, they do have. For Starlink, actually, when first we start sending the first Starlink, even I'm going to post it on my Twitter, the first one.
Okay.
I took the photo with the first one. It was during the Halloween. I took with the Halloween style. That would be a nightmare of the regime. So we sent during the October was the first shipment inside of the country, and it was first experience how you have an IT team, then the shipment, the way to find how to send inside the country. Some people, they're scared to use it because, we're talking about the revolutionary environment, the finding and installing on any house of these local leaders will be execution or the punishment, the maximum punishment, they put it for the stalling. But now we have stalling in Iran is working. It's been working for a long time, more than 6 months, I can tell you. We have a subscription for more than 6 months. So we didn't want to tell in the public. Maybe some of my friends mistakenly, they posted some photos during that time. We had some problem when a stalling video came out because it was the first days. We kept it quiet and we did well. Now there are other groups, they are starting the same project that we started. We were the first one, and as I was in charge of the whole operation as a woman, for me it's another achievement for the woman, not just for me. So it was important. So I can tell you after 1 year, yeah, that was us.
That's fascinating. So I'm sure everybody knows what Starlink is, but just in case, maybe you've seen the bright lights in the sky as they, I saw them once this summer. It's pretty amazing. Basically, devices that people can use to get internet access through satellite and through this company run by Elon Musk.
Just adding that Starlink not the only device. There are different ways too. We send a weapon inside the country, all different. We cannot talk about it today.
You sent what?
That maybe next year in the free Iran we can talk about what we did, but Starlink is one of them.
Okay, got it. Yes, one more question from the audience, please.
Hi, and thank you so much to all the panelists. My question is for you, Roxana, because everybody said how important this movement was as a cultural revolution, a turning point, something that we are not going back to the previous one. You spent 6 years in Iran. My question to you is, when you hear what happened during Women Life Freedom Movement and what your co-panelists are saying, how do you compare this with the cultural situation, with the narrative that even dissidents had during the time you were in Iran? What is the change you see right now? Thank you.
Thank you for your question. The audience could hear that remotely, right? Basically, the question was, because I had lived in Iran for 6 years and reported there, how do I see the difference between the narrative and what's going on today versus then? I lived in Iran from 2003 to 2009. And I mean, I saw various facets of Iran. I was very fortunate to. And one aspect that I got to know intimately toward the end was in prison. And it was there, actually, that I met some of the most courageous people I've ever met in my life, behind bars, who were there because they refused to be silent on issues that were important to them, which were basic freedoms like freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of belief, and freedoms that we take for granted so often in the West. For several of them, I could see that they were willing to give up their lives in order not to sacrifice these principles because they believe that these principles were necessary, not just for them, but for the country that they love, Iran. But I did not see, to the extent that I saw during the Mahsa Amini protests in the months afterward, I did not see the same feeling that I don't know how to explain this. It's much more widespread than I thought. In the past year or so, I feel like I was surprised. I was very impressed and inspired by the courage of so many Iranian people across the country, in all the provinces. It wasn't just political prisoners. It was young people, it was women, it was people of different ethnicities who were willing to put their lives in danger for other people and for their country. And I mean, I don't know how to describe it, but so many of the scenes brought tears to my eyes. And listening to Mercedes also talk today was very moving for me because, I mean, we take so many of these things for granted, to wear what we want outside, to speak freely, to use the internet, to make a phone call without thinking, am I getting monitored? You know, such basic things, equal rights for men and women. And there are so many Iranians who put themselves in danger and had to pay the price and are still paying the price for it. So I don't know where it goes, but I think that this courage and this desire for change I knew it was widespread before, but what I saw in these protests last year was courage that I had not seen while I was living in Iran, to this extent, so open and so explicit. I hope I described that well.
So explicit is exactly what it is, explicit.
Yeah. Is there time for one more question? No? Do we have to wrap up? I didn't want to monopolize the last portion. Okay. Well, thank you all for joining us. Thank you to our panelists. Thank you for everyone who came and anybody who's listening. I'm sorry if we didn't get to your questions. There's so much to talk about still.
Yeah, I know.
But we'll see what happens tomorrow and in the coming months, what happens in Iran and in the international community. And thank you to the Atlantic Council for putting together this event.
Thank you.